When it comes to fandoms on the internet, it is often interesting to see what is suddenly able to become popular. With each passing year, many have been able to track which fandoms are the most pervasive on the internet, while almost never being able to predict future hits. On one day, everyone might be raving about a new TV show that has just come out, only for most people to move on to a game that has received an update the next day. And while there are certain incorporated elements to a work that might have a more guaranteed success with future audiences, the media that truly resonates with large groups of people often do so by addressing a fundamental idea or theme that has been previously underaddressed or unmentioned. And in recent months, this hasn't been more apparent than it has been with the sudden rise of the Moomin series within certain fan communities in the United States. While this is a cute, approachable series that has had a recently released TV incarnation, what further differentiates Moomin from the expected fandom cycle can be seen within the history of the series. Unlike most other popular media franchises, the Moomins have had a widely successful career throughout the world for nearly 75 years, only for it to be widely ignored and undistributed in America, until now. Though with this sudden popularity, there are many people who are now just coming into the series and discovering the staggering amount of Moomin-related media, while also being contrasted with the many existing fans throughout the world who might be a little confused at their reactions. So let's ask ourselves, who are the Moomins? What is it about these characters that resonates with audiences? And what has suddenly changed to create the present phenomenon that has been dubbed the Moomin Renaissance? To answer these questions and more, I have spent the past number of weeks reading, watching, and researching every piece of Moomin media. Books, plays, television, films, video games, operas, anything that I could get my hands on, all to better understand these fascinating characters like Snufkin, the Snorks, Sniff, Little Mai, and of course, the Muminfamily. Though before I can discuss and analyze each major piece of Moomin media, it is going to be vital that we first discuss the woman that made this all possible. Tove Jansson was born to a Swedish-speaking family of artists in Finland. Because Swedish is a minority language amongst the country, most of her time was spent with her family, who lived a very bohemian lifestyle, alongside her father Victor, her mother Signa, as well as her two siblings, Per-Olof and Lars. With their father being a sculptor and their mother being a graphic designer, all three of the children went on to be decently respected artists, all studying art throughout Europe before the rise of fascism. During that time, Tove gained some international fame while writing for Garm, an anti-fascist satirical magazine that was extremely critical of both Hitler and Stalin, in a time when Finland was partially allied with Nazi Germany. This sort of writing work for Garm and other magazines was enough to help Jansson kickstart her work as a novelist. Jansson had always been writing since she was very young, even creating a full book when she was 14, and as a result, so much of her writing was reflective of the people and events that she experienced throughout her life, some of which were filled with great doubt and sadness. Not only was Finland in the process of combating fascism and Stalinism, but the world's future became more uncertain with the onset of nuclear warfare and environmental degradation. Though amongst this sadness, Jansson was able to take comfort in the people around her, from her family to the many people that Jansson came to love over the years. This prevalent combination of comfort and anxiety helped to greatly define Jansson as a writer, to the point where certain characters and stories became homages to the people and places that she loved. Such parallels will be pointed out as we are introduced to each respective character. Though as Finland gained independence from the Russian Empire, and the rest of Europe was comprehending the full effects of World War II, Tove would later remark, "It felt completely pointless to try and create pictures." Perhaps it was understandable that I suddenly felt the urge to write something down that would begin with, "Once upon a time." What followed had to be a fairy tale. It was inevitable. But I excused myself with avoiding princes, princesses, and small children, and chose instead my angry signature creatures from the cartoon. The aforementioned angry creatures were another childhood creation of Tove. When she was much younger, she got into an argument with Per Olav, after he began to downplay the philosophies of Immanuel Kant, which, I'm sorry, Tove, I gotta side with your brother on this one. Even if it was in the service of defending a racist pseudoscientist. This argument had angered Tove so much that she drew what she considered the most ugly creature imaginable. The Snork, as she would call it, would go on to appear in many of her paintings and cartoons. And once Tove had decided to pursue a new book, her uncle had given her a name that was once used to deter her from eating at night, telling her to beware the Moomin trolls. The name stuck, and would be incorporated into her first book, Moomin and the Great Flood. If you are amongst the people who have recently gotten into Moomin, you might be surprised at what you find when reading through Jansson's early writing within the series, especially within her 1945 short story, The Moomins and the Great Flood. Clocking in at about 50 pages, this quick tale depicts the journey of Moomin Troll and his mother to find a new home as well as the missing Moomin Papa. Throughout this journey, the two see a wide variety of locales, from a dark forest, a garden made of candy, a great stormy sea, and eventually, a flooded valley that would eventually become a new home for the Moomins. It is in this book that we are introduced to a number of colorful characters, including the cowardly Sniff, a girl with glowing hair named Tulipa, and the mysterious traveling spirits called the Hattie Fatteners, and eventually, the eccentric Moomin Papa. Already within these first stories, we can see some of the real-world influences that went into Jansson's writing, most notably within Moomin Papa and Moomin Mama. In most of her appearances, Moomin Mama is characterized with the warmth and practicality to her, as she always seems to have something useful in her handbag that can help those she cares for. Both Tove and Per Olav would say how their mother Signa was a heavy influence on this characterization. According to Per Olav, our mother taught us how to navigate by the wind, the clouds, the anthills, and the moss on the trunks. She often skied after us, forgave all of our naughtiness, and glowed peaceful and confident warmth, just like Moomin Mama. Despite only being present for the final portion of the story, this similar influence can be seen within Moomin Papa, whose eccentric and exploratory nature is greatly reflective of their father Victor, who shared a great love of throwing parties, exploring new places, and witnessing small disasters. But alongside this eccentric nature, Moomin Papa also evokes the distant tension that was felt between the two throughout Victor's lifetime. The two greatly disagreed on a lot of subjects, from Victor's anti-Semitism, Tove's involvement in leftist circles, his irresponsible nature, and the resulting amount of work that was placed on Signa as the primary breadwinner and caretaker of their home. Despite this, Tove still maintained a great respect for her father, which is greatly demonstrated in Moomin Papa's characterization as a somewhat selfish, albeit well-meaning father. While the colorful characters and beautiful illustrations made this book quite enjoyable, the overall narrative suffers from an extremely rushed pace, where our heroes are moved quickly from set piece to set piece, and small characters appear and disappear with very little consequence. Perhaps it is for this reason that this first story did not go on to sell very well. With such a lack of consistency within the characters and continuity, reading The Great Flood feels similar to early drafts of The Hobbit, as it helps to introduce the characters and the basics of the world, but serves more like a small amusing fairy tale that could serve as a jumping-off point for grander stories, all of which would be seen the following year, where Jansson's work began to really look to the skies. With the release of her first story out of the way, Tove Jansson would make quick work to write her next story with the Moomins. Released in 1946, Comet in Moominland already displays a striking improvement from the previous story. Alongside the charming characterizations established in the first novel, so much of this book is greatly improved by being given more time to develop both the plot and tone of the story. In this book, Moomin and Sniff undergo a journey once they learn about a comet that risks the total destruction of Moominvalley. While much of the story still follows an episodic structure similar to Moomin's and the Great Flood, the presence of the comet helps to create a tone of fear and horror that feels impossible to ignore, much as the characters might try to otherwise. Despite the almost idyllic characterizations that define the Moomin family, there is almost an air of disapproval that is leveled against them. As the comet moves closer to the valley, we see more of the terrible effects it has on the world. The skies grow constantly dark, animals become dangerously aggressive, the weather grows hotter and dangerous, and even the sea dries up. Likewise, the characters are initially prone to downplaying the dangers the comet presents, though this becomes increasingly difficult to do so as time goes on, to the point where the potential destruction is all but impossible to ignore. We see people abandon the valley, coop themselves in their home, and a few even exclaim the futility of the situation. One of the most popular interpretations of this story is that the comet serves as an allegory for the potential destruction wrought by nuclear warfare, as it not only destroys everything in its surrounding area, but is also out of the control for most people. As I said before, much of Jansson's writing was defined by a sense of fear and uncertainty. According to her, in every honest children's book, I think there is an element of fear. Anxious and self-confident children alike are unconsciously drawn to it, and to destruction. It is within this story that we are able to see more of an underlying philosophy that would go on to define many future stories with the Moomins. Even though it can be easy to characterize the Moomins as childish and naive, there is an open-mindedness and resilience that is still present throughout the story. Despite some of the chaos and disagreement that can be seen between the Moomin family, it never comes to translate into distrust or hatred towards other people. No matter how dire the world got, the Moomins were always there to provide a friendly face and determination to help make things better, even at a small scale. Though the Moomins were not the only reason Comet in Moominland is a vast improvement from the first story. On their journeys to find out more about the comet, Moomin Troll and Sniff are introduced to characters that would become integral to the series. First, there are the Hemulins, troll creatures similar to the Moomins who are preoccupied with order and collecting things. The intellectual Snork and his sister, the resourceful, albeit somewhat inattentive Snork Maiden, who is often portrayed as Moomin Troll's primary love interest, alongside of all the characters in this series, there are few that seem to have the same level of attention as Snufkin, the mysterious and aloof traveler who is considered Moomin's closest friend, amongst other things. There are a number of reasons why someone like Snufkin might become such a popular character. From his carefree nature, his many moments of wisdom, to the internet's affinity to tall angsty white dudes. Though I think a lot of this appreciation comes from Snufkin's disgust with authority. Similar to Moomin Papa and Moomin Mama, a lot of this characterization is drawn from the people in Tove Jansson's life. In this case, Atos Wirtanen heavily inspired much about Snufkin. Wirtanen was a prolific writer in many leftist circles, and had met Jansson when she was creating illustrations for various newspapers, and would eventually begin a relationship, even at one point being engaged. Like Snufkin, Atos was often seen with a large hat and pipe, had a great love of nature and traveling, and often desired to live in a world where material possessions weren't necessary. While there are many admirable traits to Atos, and likewise Snufkin, there is still an element of distance between Atos and Tove, and he would never really commit to a permanent life with Tove, eventually breaking their engagement. While they may not have ended up together, it is clear that Tove still displayed a great love for him, especially when examining the relationship between Moomin and Snufkin. While Snufkin would always come to settle in Moominvalley with each summer, eventually, he would have to leave with the coming winter. And while Moomin still greatly admires Snufkin's way of life, there will always be this sort of pining for one another that will remain as constant as the coming winters. Comet in Moominland went on to sell slightly better than Moomin and the Great Flood, though thanks to this connection with Apocolypse, the Moomins would become the trolls we know and love today. As previously mentioned, Jansson had a lot of experience as the illustrator for many newspapers and magazines. One of those was the Swedish leftist magazine Ny Tid, which translates to the New Times. The magazine was looking for new material to be placed in the children's section. Its editor, Atos Wirtanen asked Jansson to start publishing a weekly adaptation of Comet in Moominland. Jansson accepted the offer, but her time at Ny Tid was cut short after a year, when the comic strip attracted criticism from many of its readers. There was a common consensus that the Moomin's lifestyle was too materialistic and aristocratic for the paper's liking. Despite its short tenure in print, this would not be the last adaptation of this story. We'll go more into the specifics of these adaptations, but the story has appeared in almost every future incarnation of the Moomin books, including television shows, a film, a Bjork song, and a theatrical production made in 1949. This play is notable in that it was directed by Vivica Bandler, who would go on to direct a second play, as well as a television show based on the Moomins. It was also notable because during that time, Tove says that she went over to the spook side and began a relationship with Vivica. At the time, Vivica was married, not to mention that it was illegal to be in a same-gender relationship in Finland. As a result, the relationship had to be kept a secret, and would go on to be a big influence for the next Moomin story. (1948's Finn Family Moomin Troll is where we see Moomin settle into many of the expected staples of the series. Also referred to as the Magician's Hat, the story centers on the Moomin family finding a mysterious hat that has many magical properties. From creating flying clouds, turning water into raspberry juice, sprouting massive jungles, and even transforming people into different creatures. As it turns out, the hat is the possession of the Hobgoblin, a strange wizard that has flown all over the world on a black panther for centuries, searching for a special gem called the King's Ruby. It should be noted that the term Hobgoblin shares the same meaning as a wizard in Swedish, which is why the Hobgoblin acts as a friendly user of magic instead of the monstrous figures that are usually associated with the term. Why he flies around on a black panther is something I couldn't find any mythological or historical basis on, so if you know anything about the panther, please let me know in the comments. Regardless, the presence of the Hobgoblin's hat causes some chaos for the Moomins. Alongside the hat, this story marks the first appearance of the Groke. The Groke is a mysterious spirit that wanders Moominvalley, leaving a trail of frost and ice wherever she goes. Despite her monstrous appearance and cold exterior, the Groke is a monster that is to be pitied and not feared. The books go on to highlight the loneliness and solitude that always follows the Groke, as she goes on to embody this fear and evilness that can be found in each reader. According to Jansson's biography, she is in each human, and you can't escape her. She is waiting. Though, no matter the obstacles, the Moomins always try to deal with these hardships with the same politeness, propriety, and perseverance. Aside from the Groke and the Hobgoblin, the other most notable characters in this story come in the final act, when a pair of small creatures wander into Moominvalley with the suitcase stolen from the Groke. The pair is named Thingamy and Bob, and the suitcase contains the King's Ruby, the very same one that the Hobgoblin searches for. The two then take refuge with the Moomins, who help to ward off the Groke and give the two a place where they can feel safe and accepted. While the two's role in the plot might seem incidental, aside from one point where they steal Moomin Mama's handbag, their place in the story takes on a different dimension when examining their Swedish names of Tofsan and Vilfsan. Those are the pet names that were used between Tove Jansson and Vivica Bandler. From this lens, you have two characters that strongly care for one another, while also safeguarding the precious King's Ruby from the Groke, an embodiment of loneliness. It's not hard to see this as an allegory for what the two had to undergo during their relationship to one another, as the two had to keep their relationship safe and secret like the King's Ruby, lest they also be taken by the Grokes of the world. Though the lovely thing about Finn Family Moomin Troll is that it shows the welcoming presence this series offers to those who come across it. By the end of the story, Thingamy and Bob feel so accepted by the Moomins that they are comfortable enough to show the King's Ruby to everyone in Moominvalley. Everyone is so accepting that not even the Hobgoblin, for how long he has searched for the King's Ruby, is willing to take it from the two. Because Moominvalley is a place that strives to welcome and accept everyone who visits. Perhaps it might be seen as childish or naive to do so, but these stories were initially conceived of as a fairy tale after all, and fairy tales were designed to help teach future generations the morals and beliefs that it takes to become better than their predecessors. So perhaps it is from these stories that we can make places like Moominvalley more plentiful in our real world. Finn Family Moomin Troll comes as another highly recommended read and went on to sell more than the previous two stories, but it did little to address the financial instability that Jansson was undergoing. However, this success was greatly assisted in 1950 when Penguin Books helped to publish translated copies of the story in English, and it is here that Jansson's stories began to reach a wider audience outside of Finland, and the Moomin series will begin to take on a different shape.